today's top boxing news.
Ow! Okay, we'll start with this. One of my favorite unbeaten up-and-comers, Caroline Dubois, will be returning to action this weekend against seasoned journeywoman Happy Daudi on the undercard of Chris Smith versus Isaac Chamberlain. This will be the third professional outing for Caroline Dubois, her third fight this year and her third fight overall as a professional. I saw some slight quips, some slight criticisms that given Caroline Dubois' amateur background, surely they could find her someone better to fight than Happy Daudi, who is little more than cannon fodder for the young amateur standout, though in truth, I'm against them moving Caroline Dubois fast, given her age, that she's such a young fighter, and that she's already exhibiting such a high ceiling. You want to make the most of it. Rack up a couple more highlight reel knockouts. Get some more rounds in the bank. You've got time, unlike some other amateur standouts, amateur fighters that had extended amateur careers. Caroline Dubois got all the time in the world.
Stay away from fighting for alphabet titles, even local ones, regional ones.
The best thing to do with Caroline Dubois at this point in the juncture, given all the talent, high ceiling that she is already exhibiting, only 3 fights into her professional career, less than a year.
It has been less than a year since she went pro.
Caroline Dubois, unlike some other amateur standouts, has a very fan-friendly style. She's an athletic and spiteful puncher, a southpaw that knows how to dig to the body, knows how to hurt the girl opposite the ring. And what you want to do with a fighter like this, that's this young and this talented, is develop them gradually. Let them amass that following with those fan-friendly performances, because she is a fan-friendly fighter after all.
She's only 21 years old. What's the rush?
On a schedule like this, she could squeeze out a 4th fight this year if she so chooses, if a slot is available. And in the next 2 years,
on a schedule like this, she will have amassed enough professional experience that perhaps she will be ready to fight for an alphabet title. And not just fight for one, but successfully defend it.
Very high on Caroline Dubois. I'm not going to apologize for that. I think this fighter has all the potential to become one of the pound-for-pound greats in the sport over time. This fight she's about to have with Happy Daudi is being billed as a lightweight contest, a 6-rounder. Lightweight, that's where Katie Taylor campaigns. That's where Katie Taylor holds all of the alphabet titles. Given where Caroline Dubois is in her young career and where Katie Taylor is in hers, it's not likely that the two cross paths. They're in very different stages in their careers right now.
Given the network and promotional politics between Sky and Boxer and Matchroom and DAZN.
Like I said, it's not likely that the two ever cross paths, and Caroline Dubois is miles away from competing for a full-fledged alphabet title right now. They could hit the gas if they so choose to, the people over there at Sky and Boxer, but why do that when you have a promising young fighter that's only 21 years old? What she needs now more than anything is experience, rounds in the bank, and to amass a sizable following so that she can go on to get the big purses, the big cash, the same way that Katie Taylor's got the big purses and the big cash. That's what you want. You want to grow an organic following.
Caroline Dubois is not a tough sell. She really is a fan-friendly fighter, and she exhibits what you want to see in an amateur standout.
Polished boxing and power. Actual punching power.
She's not the only amateur standout on this card that's going to be in action this weekend.
Ben Whitaker and Fraser Clark, those two amateur standouts, they're going to be in action. We're going to see Joe Pickford.
He's going to be on there also. And I like this main event. I like Isaac Chamberlain versus Chris Smith. Makes for a good fight.
And as stated, young Caroline Dubois is going to be taking on the very seasoned Happy Daudi. Happy Daudi, who's been in there with a lot of good fighters, and I mean a lot of good fighters. She got stopped by Anisha Bashil, stopped by Firuza Sharapova. She dropped the decision to Ikram Kirwat, and I think at the hands of Caroline Dubois,
I think they're going to have to scrape Happy Daudi out of the ring with a spatula.
Happy Daudi's been knocked out. She's been stopped 6 times in her career overall, 6 times total. Once against Anisha Bashil, once against Lolita Musea, Firuza Sharapova, and I think against Caroline Dubois, in all likelihood, she's going to get stopped for the 7th time, because Caroline Dubois, I'd say, is a bigger puncher than those girls are.
With a much, much deeper amateur background than those girls.
The way I see it, this fight may not even go the full 6 rounds. It might end early. Could end as early as the 1st round. And with those things in mind, and that being said, there's still time to get Caroline a 4th fight in this year, before this year is out. So keep your eyes peeled for Caroline Dubois this weekend on the undercard of Chris Smith versus Isaac Chamberlain. In men's welterweight news, a story that's grabbing a lot of people's attention. It seems that former unified welterweight champion Keith Thurman has shot up to the #1 spot in the WBC's ranked standings, which is being interpreted as somewhat mysterious because Keith Thurman is a fighter who in the last 2.5 years or so has only fought just once, earlier this year against a super lightweight moving up in weight, coming off a knockout loss in Mario Barrios, and for that, he's being awarded a top spot in the WBC's ranked standings. Most are interpreting this as a clandestine attempt to position Keith Thurman for an Errol Spence Jr. fight should things with Terence Crawford go sideways. If those negotiations don't work out, they'll have an ace in the hole in Keith Thurman that they can so use as
he's a backup plan.
If things go sideways with Terence, what they might push to do is petition the WBC to qualify Keith Thurman as Errol Spence Jr.'s WBC mandatory challenger. The problem is that Errol's already got 2 mandatory challengers waiting for him, a Stanionis by way of the WBA and Jaron Boots Ennis by way of the IBF.
I don't even think the WBC is supposed to be next in the rotation.
When's the last time Errol Spence Jr. satisfied a mandatory for the IBF? It's been approximately, 3.5, 4 years since the Carlos Ocampo fight? The Carlos Ocampo mandated title defense? How is it that Errol Spence Jr. is getting all this leeway, this wiggle room, with all these different alphabet organizations?
The IBF is otherwise known as a very stringent and strict outfit.
It's not customary for the IBF to give any one of their champions this kind of leeway, this kind of a grace period, without having satisfied a mandatory challenger. There's a mandatory outstanding, and there's already one waiting, yet a lot of people are looking at this move from Keith Thurman by way of the WBC and interpreting it as a backup plan. Should things not work out with Terence Crawford, Errol will then move to take on Keith Thurman as his mandatory challenger in what would undoubtedly be billed as a pay-per-view. That's one scenario. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is maybe things work out between Terence and Errol. Maybe they do their fight. And maybe what this is the PBC positioning their pieces on the board for what happens after the Spence versus Crawford fight. The winner of that fight, if it's Terence Crawford, may so decide to move up in weight immediately after to take on Jermell Charlo, the junior middleweight division's undisputed champion. Terence Crawford said as much himself. If he beats Errol, he's targeting Jermell next. And if he vacates his titles, moves up in weight, the reset button gets hit.
All the belts go vacant. Somebody's got to be there to pick them up.
That somebody could be Keith Thurman. Maybe that's what this is. The PBC moving their pieces on the board, positioning them to pick up the alphabet titles if and when they go vacant. That's another way to look at it, though I maintain my original position. When's the last time Errol satisfied a mandatory for the IBF? Because by all rights, they should be next in the rotation, not the WBC.
And what about the WBA? Yordanis Ugas was under orders to face a Stanionis before the Spence fight got made.
A Stanionis who fought Radzav Butaev on the undercard of Spence versus Ugas, and the understanding was that the winner of Spence versus Ugas must then satisfy a Stanionis as their WBA mandatory challenger. Now, a unification match, an undisputed title fight like Crawford versus Spence, could be used to circumvent all of these mandatory challengers. But if by some chance that doesn't happen,
if the Spence versus Crawford fight doesn't get made,
Stanionis achieved mandatory status before Keith Thurman by way of the WBC. The same can be said for Jaron Boots Ennis. Both of those guys have been mandatory challengers for Errol's belts longer than Keith Thurman.
Keith Thurman just made this move to #1.
And look at the guys who he so conveniently skirted past Jaron Boots Ennis, who by all rights he should be fighting, skirted past Virgil Ortiz.
Looks to me like they're helping Keith Thurman avoid these guys.
They must be, because how could a fighter who's only fought once in the last 2.5, close to 3 years, achieve a #1 spot for fighting a super lightweight coming off a knockout loss at welterweight?
Don't forget, before the Mario Barrios fight, Keith Thurman took a 2-year hiatus from the sport after losing the belt to Manny Pacquiao.
The WBA title, so that he can come back against the guy who's coming off a knockout loss, who's moving up in weight, and that gets him a #1 spot by way of the WBC. How do you reconcile that?
Brown paper bag money's how you reconcile that.
I've long maintained here on the channel that the WBC manipulates their own rank standings just as much as their sister organization, the WBA, but they don't come under the same scrutiny that the WBA does. They got in hot water last year with the Alphabet Commission, and they find themselves in hot water again this year with that same commission, but the WBC seems to do what they want to their own rank standings, manipulate them however they see fit with impunity, without the Alphabet Commission batting so much as an eyelash over it. And it's obvious what they're doing. It's obvious what's going on.
Like I said, there's two ways you can look at this move.
They're either moving Keith Thurman into position to take on Errol Spence Jr. if things with Crawford don't work out, or they're planning ahead. They want him to hold that position and maintain it beyond the Crawford versus Spence fight, so if the winner of that fight vacates those titles, they stay on the PBC side of things.
At least that one. At least the green belt.
And just in keeping with the theme of confusion and clusterfucks by way of the alphabets, Anthony Joshua versus Alexander Usyk rematch. What's next for the winner? Robert Helenius demands mandatory shot. Heavyweight contender Robert Helenius has urged the WBA to establish him as the mandatory challenger for their super title and give him the next shot at the winner of Alexander Usyk versus Anthony Joshua. The victor of Usyk's rematch with Joshua on August 20th will secure that WBA title, as well as the WBO and IBF heavyweight belts, but triumphing in one of the biggest fights of 2022 will also leave the winner with a raft. Britain's Joe Joyce is positioned as the WBO's #1 heavyweight challenger, while Helenius is adamant he should be in place to force his own fight for the WBA's belt. I am rightfully the WBA mandatory, so of course I am interested in the Usyk versus Joshua winner, Helenius told Sky Sports. The 38-year-old from Finland has stopped Adam Kovnowski in his last two fights, most recently featuring prominently on the Tyson Fury versus Deontay Wilder 3 undercard. Helenius won a WBA gold belt in his first bout with Kovnowski and is currently placed at #2 in their world rankings. He is adamant he must be next in line to challenge Usyk.
Or Anthony Joshua if he wins.
I definitely should be next. Every elimination bout after mine is bullshit at this point. If we are not designated the mandatory after Usyk's next fight, we will have only one option, he insisted. My lawyers are very confident that the WBA have bungled this whole thing, so I am confident in my position.
We know that the winner of Michael Hunter versus Hughie Fury, before it was postponed, was supposed to be the mandatory challenger for Daniel Dubois' secondary title.
That was the story up until the fight got postponed, and unless something changes, that's all we have to go off of. So if that's the case and Daniel Dubois is forced to fight that fighter, the winner of that fight, where does that leave Robert Helenius? Sky Sports approached the WBA for a comment. Helenius will be looking for further opportunities this year, possibly as a comeback opponent for Deontay Wilder or even Tyson Fury. British contenders like Daniel Dubois or Joe Joyce could also view him as the right fight to position themselves for a shot at a major title. For now, I will just stay focused on training and see how Usyk versus Joshua and my WBA status plays out, Helenius said. But I remain in a great position for something very big.
Yeah, I mean, they could just do a fight between Robert Helenius and Daniel Dubois straight away.
Because the Michael Hunter versus Hughie Fury fight is in the process of being rescheduled, and because the winner of that fight was supposed to take on Daniel Dubois, well, until a winner emerges, why don't they just do a fight between Daniel Dubois and Robert Helenius and just be done with it?
Does Robert Helenius want that fight?
Does Daniel Dubois? It's no secret that Robert Helenius won't make the money fighting Daniel that he could make fighting the winner of Joshua versus Usyk II, though if that's what he's gunning for, when does he expect to get the winner of that fight in the ring, it being that he's not the only guy waiting in the queue? There's also Joe Joyce. There's also the winner of Hrgovic versus Zhang when that fight gets scheduled.
Rescheduled. The winner of that fight becomes the mandatory challenger by way of the IBF.
The last mandatory challenger that got satisfied for all three of those alphabet titles was Alexander Usyk. Back when AJ was the reigning champion and he had all the belts, he satisfied Usyk for the WBO and Kubrat Pulev for the IBF before him. And based on a rotation like that, the WBA's mandatory challenger would presumably be next. But given that the titles have changed hands, does that affect the current rotation?
I don't know, but I know it's been a long time since a WBA mandatory challenger got satisfied at heavyweight.
The last mandatory challenger that got satisfied by way of the WBA was Alexander Povetkin in the Anthony Joshua fight. That was, what, 2.5, maybe 3 years ago? Maybe a little longer?
And then later, much later, Kubrat Pulev was satisfied as a mandatory by way of the IBF.
all satisfied by Anthony Joshua, who followed up by satisfying his mandatory challenger by way of the WBO, Alexander Usyk, but because the titles changed hands, because Anthony Joshua lost the fight, does that alter the rotation, or by all rights, should the WBA's mandatory challenger be next? And who's that mandatory challenger going to be? Is it going to be Robert Helenius, or is it going to be the secondary title holder, Daniel Dubois?
I'll tell you the truth. Robert stands to make the most money facing the winner of Joshua versus Usyk II.
There were some rumblings, some talks in some circles, small ones, that Robert Helenius may end up fighting Deontay Wilder in what could be Deontay Wilder's comeback fight, though very recently the WBC stated that if Tyson Fury doesn't make a decision as to what he wants to do by October, they're going to order Deontay Wilder to take on Andy Ruiz for what could be the newly vacated WBC title.
I've long maintained that Robert Helenius didn't find himself on the undercard of Wilder versus Fury 3 by accident.
I've long maintained that at least I think, Robert Helenius is in the running for Deontay Wilder's big comeback fight, but then again, so is Andy Ruiz. So who's going to get the fight, if there even is a fight? Because we're not hearing much in terms of news when it comes to Deontay Wilder.
You know, a lot of the confusion that's created at heavyweight is because Tyson Fury still has that alphabet title, but he claims to be retired.
If the belt would have went vacant immediately after he announced his quote-unquote retirement, we'd have more conclusive answers by now.
Conclusive answers about Deontay Wilder, who's currently ranked at #1 by way of the WBC.
Conclusive answers about Andy. Conclusive answers about who it is the winner of Joshua versus Usyk II has to face in order to become an undisputed champion in this era. And perhaps even more conclusive answers when it comes to Robert Helenius and what's next for him.
WBA is currently in hot water due to bribe allegations that surfaced in some court documents very recently.
It's not a smoking gun, but it might be enough to scare them straight, at least temporarily, into ordering fights that need to be ordered, like perhaps Robert Helenius versus Daniel Dubois. Right now, that fight makes the most sense to me.
Yeah, because Michael Hunter and Hughie Fury are all tied up with each other.
So order that fucking fight, why don't you?